Hello and welcome to episode 154 of Page One, the Writers' Podcast. I'm Tarek.
I'm Marco, and thanks for joining us on the podcast where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing process, find out how they got into the industry and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. And we've got a great back catalogue of guests there, so please do check that out if this is your first episode. And if it is your first episode, we've got a good one for you today.
Yeah, it's an excellent one today. We're chatting with the wonderful Anne O'Brien, who has had, like many of our guests, an interesting route to where she now finds herself. She started off as a history teacher, having studied that at university, but always kind of wanted to become a writer. Did some short story, did some competitions, and then began writing historical romance, and has now found herself in this kind of quite cool world of historical fiction with a focus on the women of medieval history, perhaps, who have not been in the spotlight.
Yeah, sort of underwritten characters in history, I guess. And, you know, when we've had people that write historical fiction on the podcast before, we've always asked this question is, you know, how important is accuracy as compared to authenticity? You know, is it important to have the exact events and dates and stuff as the history books tell us? And for Anne, as we'll learn, it is very important. So, yeah, we have a good discussion about that. Obviously, a discussion of when you can and can't use your imagination or artistic license when you're writing historical fiction like that. And then she's got an interesting way of sort of plotting these novels out with multiple timelines that she's writing down to work out how everything is going to fit together. So it's a really interesting chat. So we will get straight to it after a quick advert for a writer's notebook. And at the end of the podcast, we'll be back with some exciting news about the podcast. So please do stay listening at the end of the podcast for that.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What did they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with Page One.
Did you always want to be a writer? Because obviously I know you studied history and then had a career as a teacher. Was writing something that was always in the background for you?
No, it never was. I was a reader, but no thought about writing. And when I was teaching history, to be honest, it took up most of my time. So the thought of writing didn't really come onto my horizon. Although I did write some short stories, I didn't feel I was particularly good at it. And the thought of writing a full-scale novel didn't enter my thoughts until I gave up teaching. and we moved house, and life was very pleasant, but I found I didn't have enough to do with my time, and so I thought I would have a go at writing a book, just to see if I could. Mm-hmm. And because I taught history, I decided I would simply attempt a romance, typical traditional romance. And so that's what I did.
And am I right in saying that with the short stories, had you entered those into competitions and things like that and had some success there?
Yes, I did. I entered one at a local library, which I lived in Beverley in the East Riding, and which I won to my surprise. And I also entered one, a very brief 500-word one, nice, with the Yorkshire Post, and won that one. But even that didn't inspire me to go on and write something, 100,000 words or whatever. But I suppose, yes, it made me think that it was possible that I could put two words together into a sentence, And so, yes, I wrote romances. But then I wasn't satisfied with doing that. I decided I wanted to write about people who actually lived. Mm-hmm. And the ones that really took my interest were medieval women. And I thought that I would try my hand at that and see what would happen. Medieval women get very short shrift in history, and I thought they deserved a promotion. And so I would try that. And that's where I started writing properly, if you like.
Well, I mean, as you say, you started off writing historical romances. I think this is back in 2005. And,
yes,
what was once you'd kind of finally had that thought, actually, I can write a full-length novel now, and you wrote that first novel, what was your process at that point? Did you find an agent? How did you get the book out there?
While I was writing romances, no. I simply sent them to the publisher, and I had no agent. But when I started thinking about writing more in depth and about people who the general public might not know anything about, mm-hmm. Then I thought I needed some support. Mm-hmm. And so I bought the Writers and Artists Yearbook and looked for an agent, yep. And got one.
Was that a long search, or did you find one fairly quickly?
Oh, yes. You have to, even with the romances, you have to be fairly thick-skinned.
Yeah.
And I could have papered my kitchen with rejection notices. And this was back in the day when you couldn't even send them off by email. Mm-hmm. They had to be the first 3 chapters in hard copy. And so they kept coming back to me, and I kept sending them out again. But yes, you have to believe in what you want to do. Not easy.
No. And so you made this move from romances into writing about, as you say, real people, yes. Albeit in your fictional sense, but you wanted to point the spotlight on them. But how when you decided to make that change, did it involve a change in your process? Did you have to put more research into it, given that it was based on
yes.
a real person?
Yes, absolutely. Research is a vast importance in this sort of thing. Otherwise, it just becomes fiction, mm-hmm. Rather than historical fiction. And so the research has to give you the absolute bedrock of what you're writing, so that you know that you are accurate, that your characters have history in the background, that is accurate, and no anachronisms, nothing that's wrong and that historians will pick up as being wrong. And so research is vital for this. I think if you're writing a romance, yes, as long as your basic idea of the period you're writing in is fine, then it will work. But it won't when you're writing about historical figures.
Mm-hmm. And where do you draw the line then? Because as you say, it is important that you're writing, that you do your research and you're not writing fiction. But then where do you, how do you balance that against the needs of the story? And, do you have more of an authenticity slant? Is it more important to you that the history is right, or would you rather have a good story and maybe bend some facts a little bit to make sure it's still a good plot?
I don't bend the facts. When I'm writing, the character, because it's a novel, my main character is the primary focus for me.
Okay.
And the history is there in the background to highlight what she, because I write about women, what she is doing and the influences on her, but it's not at the forefront. Because if you do that, then it's sort of bolt on history to the actual story of the person you want to develop.
Yeah.
And so, for example, I write in the first person as well. Some things have to be dealt with very carefully. For example, if there is a battle going on, and there often are battles in medieval history, it doesn't work to write 5 sides of what's happening in the Battle of Barnet, for example, in the Wars of the Roses. It has to be there as an influence on the person, but it can't be the priority.
Yeah.
And so it has to be dealt with carefully.
So you kind of have the focus on this character, and am I right in saying that it's still a character that's a real person, though?
Yes.
Yes. So you're still bound by, I guess, what they did and where they were at certain points of the year and certain years of their life, etc. I think you can't change that stuff. And it's all about just, or I suppose, is there parts of their life that you do change, or is it important to you that person's life is very true to life?
For me, it's important that person is true to life, and also the other characters who come into the story, because they react with that woman,
okay.
And they have a bearing on how her life develops, changes, ends, whatever it happens to be. So they are there as true historical characters, and all the drama comes from the history of what they do, and so they take important roles in the story, but the background things, as I say, battles, what's happening at the royal court, what might be happening abroad, it has to be sensitive, shall I say, to what's going on. Otherwise, it just takes over. And anybody wanting to know about the story of these people, they find it, and I find it, a drawback to what I'm trying to write. But no, I stick to what happens as accurately as I possibly can.
But there must be as well some leeway or some need for you almost to expand on it, in the sense that the reason that many of these historical figures aren't known is that the history books don't feature these people in the depth that you're covering them, obviously, in the books as well. So obviously you're piecing it together from, I imagine, a lot of different sources and trying to build up this picture of who this person was and what they did. But there must be gaps sometimes that appear that you have to use some, I don't know if it's artistic license is the right phrase, but you have to fill in. You have to fill in some way to bring the person fully to life where they aren't perhaps in the history books.
Yes, that is exactly so. It is accurate history as far as it goes, but then because these people have to come alive for the reader, there has to be an element of imagination to make them shine in the pages of the book. And what are they doing, as you say, between this fact and that one that we know about? They must be doing something. And so, yes, it's imagination, but I think it's got to be relevant to the period of history. Sure. And me asking the question, what would this woman be doing at this point in time? She has got to be, she has a role in history, she has a role in the family, so develop it and show that she is a person as well, with a family, if you like, with emotions and so on. And so I've got no problem with that at all, as long as in the end I can read it and think it reads correctly and it sounds right. And, a reader will say, yeah, that's okay.
Yeah.
So where do you come up with your ideas for these books then? Because, is it a case of looking through history books, finding a character who's been maybe, misplaced by the history books and saying, this is someone which I want to tell their story? Because I suppose if you're bound by what really happened, it's not a case of really your own idea. It's a case of finding an idea that's never been really read yet.
Yes, what I do is think about women who've appeared in medieval history. We tend to know what their menfolk are doing, whether it's brother, father, husband, and yet they, although we might know their name and have a certain amount of information about them, they still sit on the sidelines.
Yeah.
And so history would have us believe that they do nothing but sit in their solar, in their castle, and stitch samplers and pray for their husband's welfare in battle and bring up the children. And for quite a number of women, it's clear that they do more than that. And so there has got to be quite a hinterland for these women for me to draw on. But for example, Joan of Navarre, who became the Queen of Henry IV, for her, there is the accusation of witchcraft in her background, and the fact that she was sent to Leeds Castle as a prisoner because she was accused of witchcraft. There's an interest there to begin with. And it's then a case of looking at the rest of her life and seeing what can make her an interesting character. Another one is Constance of York, whose whole family was accused of treason. What was she doing? Was she as treasonable as the rest of them? And the answer is probably yes. And so can I make it a story that's worth the reading? And there are a number of women like that, some of them very young, like Anne Neville, who became the wife of Richard III, and so Queen of England. What's she got to say about this very difficult time in English history? And it is then a matter of going back to history books, online sources, and finding out as much as I can about them, and creating. What I do is create at the beginning a timeline of their life, and looking at what will be the most dynamic aspects of that life, and seeing if it's a possible. If it's a possible book to write, it has to have enough meat in it.
Yeah, sure.
If it hasn't, then I abandon them and go on to somebody else. But if there is, and if their husbands, brothers, whatever, are interesting enough, then I'll take them on and put them in the centre of that story of what their family is doing.
And so, I mean, it sounds in that process, in terms of your actual writing process, obviously there's a huge amount of research that goes into it, but yes. I imagine, are you someone then that will outline the story, plan it out before you actually start writing, given that you've got to pull all these threads together?
Yes, I start with a timeline of my main female character, and then I have a parallel one of the others in her family who will interact with her, so side by side. And then a third one of the events during her life that will have an impact on that life. And so I've got 3 to look at. It's then a matter of deciding where to start. The beginning, childhood is not usually a good idea, but somewhere there is usually an event that makes me think, this is where I want to start this book. This is the first time that this woman emerges from the background, perhaps, and makes a dynamic presence within her family. And so I might actually write that scene, thinking this may not be the beginning in the end, and it won't be the end, but let me just write it to see how the characters come onto the page. I don't write it. I don't write on pages anymore. But you take my point.
Yeah.
And so that's where I start. And if I like what happens, then I might write some of the other most important scenes. So they're all disconnected, if you like, at that point. But I know it won't matter in the end. And if it looks as if they will come to life, all of them, and it will be exciting and dynamic and emotional, of course, then I think, yes, this will work. And so then I will probably go back to the beginning and start writing from the beginning. Although it may not be the beginning when the book is finished. I may decide it wants a prologue of some description, or perhaps it might want pushing on to make. And I don't always know where it will end. The book will tell me that. And I don't always know at this point who the other really important characters in the book will be. Sometimes minor ones emerge and almost say, I have a role in this. Will you kindly write me in? You know, and so I do. So it's interesting. In fact, it's fascinating for me, and I hope in the end for the reader.
So it sounds like you've got a sort of, you have a sort of outline or timeline, as you say, but
yes,
you're also doing a bit of sort of discovery writing, as they call it, as well as you're writing it, and the characters sort of emerge from that as well.
Yes, and when I start writing sometimes, as I say, without having a clear idea of where it's going. And so the writing and the research go on side by side at that point. And I keep the writing going because it's what I enjoy, but the research has to keep going. And it may, in fact, change. If I find something different, it may change a scene that I've written previously, and it's something I have to accept. And I do. And I find that interesting as well.
And it sounds like in terms of when you're doing, planning or plotting, a lot of that is almost done for you, I guess, because you've got that kind of real life historical through line that you're following and that you don't want to deviate from. So it's a case of working out where about on that person's historical line is the most interesting time to write about.
Yes, it is. And so anything that is not very dramatic or of great interest, I'm quite prepared to omit. So a lot of early life sometimes. I've written about Cecily Neville, the wife of Richard, Duke of York, and decided to come into the story when she's a mature woman with a full-grown family, because at that point, she makes a stand in history at Ludlow Castle, and it seemed the ideal part to open up the story and Cecily's life. Whereas what she might be doing back at Raby in her childhood didn't interest me greatly, and I wasn't sure I could make it great for the reader either. But Ludlow, at that point, when her husband leaves her and she's left on her own with her youngest children in the centre of Ludlow, with the rampaging Lancastrian army coming in, that seemed to me the ideal point to start writing.
Yeah,
but it's a judgment on my part.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And in terms of do you have a daily routine? Do you have a word target every day? Do you work 9 to 5? How does the actual process of writing work for you?
I'm a morning writer. I start about 8 o'clock. And apart from a brief coffee break, I write through till somewhere between 12 and 1. I don't have a word aim, because if I am writing from scratch, I might get through 2,000 or 3,000 words roughly. If I am editing, then it's much less, because at that point I'm polishing. So I simply do a morning's work. And when the deadline approaches, then, I start to worry if I'm not there. But as I say, I don't worry about number of words by any means. And that's it, really. It depends where I am in the book. If I am at the beginning of writing, then it's another chapter to attack and see where it takes me. If it's editing, then it's painstaking, chapter after chapter, removing things I don't like, adding, because I do a number of drafts, it's rather like layers of a cake. Mm-hmm. And the first one is the storyline, to get that in place. And then the second one is to really polish up the characters and make sure they're doing what they ought to be doing, mm-hmm. and that they're all interesting and important. And then the third one is adding the historical detail, if you like, to make it come alive, the costume, the jewellery, the family events in the background. And that comes third to really boost the book to be something of interest. And then the fourth one is where it all comes together, I hope, and that's the final polish.
Nice. Yeah. Well, your latest book is A Marriage of Fortune. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what the book's about?
I knew about the Paston family, this letter-writing family from Norfolk, simply because they comment frequently on what's happening in the Wars of the Roses. Mm-hmm. So as a resource, they are excellent. What I didn't realise some time ago is that in the 400 plus letters that were discovered in this cache, over 100 of them were written by a woman, Margaret Paston. She was a Paston by marriage, not by birth, but something like 107 letters were hers. And this, of course, is unusual. We know that there are literate women during the Middle Ages, but they tend to be high-profile women like Julian of Norwich or Marjorie Kemp, and people whose names are well known. But here was a woman from a middling sort of family who apparently was extremely literate and went out of her way to write letters. So what had she got to say for herself? She didn't actually write all the letters physically. She dictated a lot of them, but she always signed them in her own name at the end. And the letters clearly have her voice behind them. Loud and clear, you can tell it's a letter by Margaret. So I decided it was worth my while looking at what she was writing about. If it was simply lists of commodities that she wanted her sons and her husband to send her from London, then there was nothing there to interest me greatly. But it soon became clear that she wrote about everything you could imagine in a family. And this is when my interest began to spike for her. She writes about family disputes, about problems with her children. When this book starts, A Marriage of Fortune, she's a widow, in fact, with 7 children. And she writes about the problems that they bring her. Difficult sons who won't be as obedient as she would like. Sons who don't get to grips with forming marriage alliances. And then the younger ones who are typical youngsters, and difficult to pin down. Then there is the problem of the legal situation for the family. They just had inherited a castle, Caister Castle, which would bring them up from peasantry to gentry. But there was every problem that they would lose that castle because of the enemies in Norfolk. And then there are the girls in the family who won't make the marriages who she wants them to make. Marriage is all important, of course, for this level of family. They must make good marriages to bring them land and finance and good connections with important families. And the girls are as disobedient as their brothers when this happens. And so when I discovered all this, how could I not write about them? I've written the first of the 2 novels already, but this one opens up with them just about to lose Caister Castle, and they're faced with a siege and all the other problems that Margaret writes about. And I had to write about them.
Excellent. Nice. And you said obviously there that you've written previous books with these characters and stuff.
Yes.
How do you know how many books it will take to tell the story of these people?
When I started writing the prequel, The Royal Game, it ended quite quite naturally, with Margaret thinking that life was going to be fairly straightforward from here on, the end of that book. And suddenly she finds that they have got a siege on their hands, and their castle has got an army around it. And so that was the first one. And the second book naturally followed from there, when her sons have to take on the siege. They have to get allies to give them some support against this main enemy, the Duke of Norfolk, who is far more powerful than they are. And then in the background, as I said, there is the story of the daughters and the terrible situations they put Margaret in. And so it fell naturally into two. And there is not a third one there at the end of it. I did look at it to see if there was, but no, it ends very neatly at Margaret's death, and the family history is taken on by one of her sons and his wife, who is quite a famous woman. She is the woman, she's called Marjorie Bruce, who wrote the first Valentine letter to John Paston. And of course, it's a well-known letter in history. She dictated it to a clerk in the household as well, even though it's a love letter. But she writes about him as being her true Valentine, and she draws a little heart at the end, which is all very sweet and romantic. But quite interesting that a medieval gentry family would do this. And it ends with her and her husband John taking on the family into what will be into the Tudors. But there is not the same level of what to write about there. It ends naturally with this point.
It's funny, there's obviously a desire to read these types of stories right now. I mean, there's obviously, you've got yourself, you've got people like Carol McGrath with the Mistress Cromwell, you've got Miranda Mallins with the Puritan Princess. Is there have you felt that there's a real urge right now in the public for these types of historical stories, more than there was in the past, perhaps?
Yes, I think that's true. I think one thing to wean people away from is that it's always got to be about the royal family, because they are endlessly interesting and entertaining and popular. And I think once that the reading public realises that this middling sort of people are as interesting in their own right. And I've had some wonderful reviews of the Pastons. Once they realise that, then yes, it takes their interest, and to show, yes, they're interested that they're climbing the social ladder and becoming gentry, aristocracy, whatever, but that these families exist and are interesting in their own right. And particularly since the Pastons give so much detail about what's happening to them. One of the main ones that is also one of the famous ones is that Marjorie's elder daughter insists on marrying the bailiff. Now, this family didn't want that to happen. They wanted marriage to a gentry family. The bailiff came from a shopkeeper's family. And what happens is the scandal behind it. And of course, scandals are always popular with the reading public, whichever level of society they are in. And true. So this story within A Marriage of Fortune between Marjorie Paston and Richard Calais, the bailiff, is a main part of it, and shows the heartache that it puts the families through. And yes, it's very popular.
And I think I'm right in saying that you've got a sort of rough schedule, it appears, of a book a year almost. I mean, how far ahead are you working? Are you working on the next book already? Is it already done? You know, what stage is that at?
Yes, in fact, this A Marriage of Fortune, it took a bit longer to get it to press for all sorts of reasons. And so while we've been going through the end bits of putting it together and the editing and so forth. I am well on the way to
finishing
the next book. In fact, my deadline is the end of January, so it's a good thing that I am. I've gone back to the Welsh Marches where I live with another woman who was put in a very difficult position in society, and a family that's absolutely covered with treason at this time. I'm writing about Roger Mortimer, Earl Mortimer, who of course is notorious as the one who had the affair with Isabella, the Queen, a wife of Edward II, and his wife. And his wife, Joan de Jonville, was an heiress, an important woman in her own right. And I thought it would be fascinating to write about how a woman of her class and her standing in society coped with the humiliation of being put in this position by a husband whom she thought in early life she had a very close relationship with. They seemed to have a very affectionate, if not a love affair. They had 10 children who all lived on into adult life. And suddenly, because of he had to go into exile because of treason against the king, and he came back with Isabella, his mistress. And how would she cope with that? And I thought it deserved writing about. So that's what it is at the moment.
Excellent. And as you research, you must always pick up hints of potential other stories that you might want to explore in the future.
Yes, you mean as I'm researching one, do I pick up another?
Yeah.
Yes, and in fact, the one I think I will write next is about Anne Beecham, who is the great-granddaughter, I think I've got enough greats in there, of Roger and Joan. And of course, she married the Earl of Warwick the Kingmaker. And so it will take us back to 15th century. I keep swapping centuries quite happily here, but back into the 15th century to show how she will cope with a situation where her husband becomes the arch traitor, if you like, and dies in battle. And she is punished for it. It's the lot of women in society at this time that whatever their husbands do, the women tend to pay the price. And Joan de Jonville ends up in prison in Skipton Castle and is in prison for almost 5 years because of what her husband gets involved with. And Beecham loses all her lands and her title and has to go into living in sort of isolation because of Warwick. And I think it's worth looking at how they cope with this and how they survive and how they come back to being part of society again. And so, yes, it's ongoing. And I do come across people, I think, oh, yes, that will make a really good character for a future book.
It is great because we've said before on the podcast that, historical fiction is a great way of kind of, learning about history by the back door. You almost don't realize that you're learning about something because you're reading it in a kind of, it feels like fiction almost. It feels like it's just a story, but it's actually, there's all that, not just the person's storyline, but also the background characters, the setting, what the technology, what was the way of life, all that kind of stuff just seeps through, and it's a great way to get a kind of snapshot of a textbook, but in a really much more interesting format.
Yes, I think what you say is absolutely spot on there. And a number of people who communicate with me on Facebook, social media and what have you, or have written reviews say, well, I didn't like history at school, but reading it in this format with a story as the primary part, but the history in the background, I really enjoy it. Yeah. And I wish I'd met it like this earlier. And yes, it can drive people to see what is attractive there, and that history is simply not facts on a page, but it's got people in it who they may have different influences on them. For example, we don't see the influence on the whole of religion or of lack of independence for women or of the power of the family behind women. But apart from that, they are very much like us. They tell the same stories at home. They laugh, they cry, they mourn, they lose people in terrible heartache, but have great happiness and achievement too. And I think once we realise that people in history are not so different from us, then it opens up history to a lot more people, which is what I hope I do.
Yeah, I think you definitely do. What was the last book that you read?
Right, the last one I read was in fact crime, and I'm not a big reader of crime, but I like the books by Ellie Griffiths about the archaeologist, so that it brings in crime and bringing up the bodies, and modern ones, but also historic ones and detectorists and such, and on wonderful atmospheric place in Norfolk. So I enjoy that, and that was the last one I read, the recent one.
Excellent.
What about the last film that you watched?
I'm not a big watcher of films, but the programmes I do enjoy, and I'm thinking of television particularly, and one that's starting up again in the new year is Digging for Britain, which I'm a newcomer to. I understand it's into.
I've not heard of that one.
Oh, it's Alice Roberts, and she brings together a number of digs every week, perhaps 6 of them from around the country, and puts them all together so that we look at what's happening in archaeology in various places in Britain, and they are fascinating. And because they are short snippets, it really brings an idea of what's going on. And I find them really enjoyable. And there's a new one coming in the new year.
Nice.
And so I can't, really, really good. And talking of detectorists, I really enjoyed that series too, the comedy one. Yeah. And that's coming back at Christmas, isn't it? And,
fantastic. Well, the very, very last thing we always do is super quick fire either or, and I always say there's no right answer here apart from one perhaps, but we'll start off with Hilary Mantel or C.J. Sansom.
Hilary Mantel. Yes, I really, really enjoyed those books.
Yeah, they're brilliant.
Yeah, yes. And I enjoyed the television presenting of it too.
Yeah.
I thought it was done extremely well, and the characters were so true to how she had written them. They were splendid, yes.
Brilliant.
TV or cinema?
TV.
Night owl.
I rarely get to the cinema. I live in the depths of the country.
Night owl or early bird?
Early bird. Yes.
Music or no music when you're writing?
Difficult one. No music when I am doing the nitty-gritty of first writing. When I am editing, I like music in the background, and I like medieval stuff. I like choral chants and that sort of thing. Nice. That's atmospheric, and great.
And the last one, audiobook or ebook?
Ebook. Although I see the value of audio, but I like ebooks.
Yes, I finally found someone who backs me up. Ebooks. Here we go. This is the start. I can tell this is the groundswell, grassroots movement coming in.
We always ask our guests that question, and very, very few say ebook at that point. So
ebook gets a short shift. I'm glad to find someone else who will take it to their grave with me. That's fine.
I will, yes, and I will too.
Excellent. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.